The morning was white with spray, and the air smelled of hot oil. Men moved as if on a living deck, barefoot sailors with soot-streaked faces hauling planes into the sun, while below them the ship's bones shivered with every catapult launch. That image, open hangars, aircraft tied wingtip to wingtip, crews living with the constant rattle of engines, is how the story begins, and where the choice that would haunt Tokyo Bay and the Midway Atoll reveals itself. The decision to make carriers into flying factories rather than floating fortresses. From the first sketches in the 1920s, Japanese naval architects felt the tug of two incompatible desires. They had watched British and American carrier experiments and arrived at a conclusion shaped by geography and doctrine. Japan sits on a narrow arc of ocean with few friendly ports, and to reach the enemy, they would need the reach of airplane wings. So the carrier had to be not simply a ship that survived hits, but a ship that could deliver a storm of aircraft, as many, as fast, and as often as possible. The architect's pencil scraped away armor where it would cost flight deck space and tucked weight into hangars, fuel stowage, and more powerful island structures. The through line here is simple and relentless. Every ounce saved meant another plane up, another strike out beyond the horizon. Men who sailed those ships felt the logic as sweat and strain. In the hangars, the air tasted of aviation gasoline and lacquer. Men slept on folded canvas near wing roots, waking to the smell of heated oil and the shriek of starting engines. They were proud of the numbers, the way a full complement looked like an air force stacked inside a ship. But there was always that unease when the squadron returned late. Burned edges on wings and oil leaking like dark tears. Captains paced their charts, and chiefs muttered about flimsier bulkheads than in the heavy cruisers. There were arguments in staff rooms about armored decks, but each time armor meant fewer planes. And to commanders who had memorized the doctrine of decisive battle, fewer planes meant that day might be lost before it began. The engineering trade-offs were not merely abstract. Japanese carriers commonly used a deck and hangar layout optimized around longitudinal framing that preserved a long, uninterrupted hangar bay. That continuity made handling large numbers of Mitsubishi Zero fighters and Aichi D-350 dive bombers swift and surgical. A squadron could be pushed to the catapult and gone within minutes. But it also meant that the flight deck, often only a few scant centimeters of steel over timber, offered precious little resistance to a bomb that found its mark. One hidden gem. Several Japanese carriers employed a semi-rigid hangar roof structure that acted like a single shell. It was excellent for aircraft handling, but terrible at localizing explosion damage. A single bomb could pancake through, ignite the aviation fuel hoarded in ready-use tanks, and set an inferno that moved like a living thing through the arteries of the ship. Another surprise lay in materials and supply. Japan's steel industry in the 1930s could not match the output of the United States, and what steel was available was rationed towards the big offensive projects: battleship armor, cruiser belts, and the engine plants that would power distant fleets. The naval staff, driven by an appetite for a decisive strike, accepted an implicit arithmetic. Armor costs weight, and weight steals range. A carrier armored like a battleship would be slower or shorter ranged or would simply carry fewer warplanes. The shortage turned design into psychology. Engineers learned to accept fragility as a price for reach. Sailors learned to accept it as fate. Doctrine sealed the choice. The Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, trained its pilots for massed torpedo and dive bomber attacks designed to cripple an enemy in one lightning blow. The hope was for a single overwhelming stroke that would negate attrition. In that doctrine, a carrier had to deliver aircraft and then vanish to avoid the duel of shells. Emphasis on night recovery and dispersed fueling was less developed. Damage control doctrine lagged amid the rush to perfect launch cycles. Aboard ship, that doctrine translated into racks of bombs left on deck ready for the next sortie. Flammable linoleum floorings, rows of open-oiled elevators. The smell of ready ammunition was constant, and the men knew that one spark could convert readiness into disaster. A third hidden gem. Japanese anti-flash measures were, in many cases, designed for different threats. They feared boarders and internal explosions from munitions more than the armor-piercing bombs that American naval aviators would bring. Spacing between fuel lines and magazines, compartmentalization and venting were modern enough, but the sheer volume of aviation fuel carried and the practice of keeping ready planes loaded with fuel and ordnance on the hangar deck multiplied vulnerability. That calculation had been acceptable when strikes were thought to be decisive and short. It proved deadly in protracted air battles. You could chart the consequences in paint and steel. The first day bombing at Coral Sea was a whisper of what could happen. Carriers survived with heavy damage, and crews whose faces were carved by smoke and salt. But at Midway, the arithmetic and human cost snapped taut. The mood in the wardrooms hardened into a metallic quietness as reports filtered through. Airplanes missing, signals garbled, deck crews working with burned fingers and collapsing ladders. The battle that seared itself into memory was not decided by one bomb or one lucky torpedo, but by the collision of doctrine and industrial limitation. As American dive bombers found the hangars with their fuel-soaked interiors, fires spread like lightning across oak floors and canvas-covered wings. Men who had pushed planes aloft on sunlit mornings now clawed at searing decks, feeling metal buckle and the smell of cordite and flesh. The climax is not a single image of a ship dying, but of a crew watching their livelihood and their weapons turn into conspirators of flame. Then came the small, counterintuitive realization that should have been obvious. The flight deck itself, if properly armored and thicker, would have sometimes limited the immediate damage of near misses and glancing blows. That is the aha moment. Not that armor is always superior, but that the specific balance Japan chose amplified certain American tactics. Armoring flight decks would have meant fewer planes, slower operational tempo, and perhaps fewer hits inflicted early in the war. But it would also have given crews precious minutes under attack, minutes in which trained damage control teams could isolate fires, jettison fuel, and save ship and men. In other words, the very decision that produced tactical brilliance at Pearl Harbor and early Pacific clashes also magnified the mortal peril for the men who served below that thin skin. After Midway, the strategic picture turned. American industrial horsepower could replace lost carriers at a rate Tokyo could not match. The Japanese Admiralty found itself facing a cruel arithmetic it had always known, but which now had become a sentence. Losses could not be absorbed. The crews who remained on the remaining carriers fought with the knowledge that their ships would not shrug off the same wounds twice. They developed desperate improvisations, more water lines, reinforced splinter decks, additional foam extinguishers, but these were stitches on a ship that needed a new backbone. The final turn of the story is quiet and bitter. The carriers that dominated the opening acts of the Pacific War did so because they were built for speed, numbers, and audacity. Men who lived and died on those decks cherished the aircraft that made them feel invincible and cursed the thin steel that offered no comfort when the sky filled with tracer. The lesson that lingers like the smell of burned varnish is not that the designs were foolish, but that design is always an inversion of priorities. Choices that deliver glory early can deliver disaster later when opponents adapt and resources become decisive. In the cold wake of defeat, dockyards and naval architects in Tokyo, and later in other navies, would reshuffle the balance between armor and aircraft. But for those who pulled on oilskins on a spring morning, who watched their comrades climb into cockpits and salute before disappearing into the sun, the cost became more personal than strategic. The carriers lacked armor because men had decided that striking first was worth the risk. And when those strikes no longer decided battles, the lack of armor read like a ledger of lives. Decades later, divers still find fragments of burned plywood and rivets in the deep, and farmers on remote islands sometimes uncover charred rivets and a bent propeller. They are small ruins of a grand gamble, the faith that speed and numbers could replace armor, a faith that left very little to burn and still too much to lose.